David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 4, I Fall into Disgrace. I was awakened by somebody saying, "Here he is," and uncovering my hot head. My mother and Peggotty had come to look for me, and it was one of them who had done it. "Davy," said my mother, "what is the matter?" I thought it was very strange that she should ask me, and answered, "Nothing." I turned over on my face, I recollect, to hide my trembling lip, which answered her with greater truth. "Davy," said my mother. "Davy, my child." I dare say, no words she could have uttered would have affected me so much then as her calling me her child. I hid my tears in the bedclothes and pressed her from me with my hand when she would have raised me up. "This is your doing, Peggotty, you cruel thing," said my mother. "I have no doubt about it. How can you reconcile it to your conscience, I wonder, to prejudice my own boy against me? What do you mean by it, Peggotty?" Poor Peggotty lifted up her hands and eyes and only answered, in sort of a paraphrase of the grace I usually repeated after dinner, "Lord forgive you, Mrs. Copperfield, for what you have said this minute. May you never be truly sorry." "It's enough to distract me," cried my mother. "On my honeymoon, too, when my most inveterate enemy might relent, one would think, and not envy me a little peace of mind and happiness. Davy, you naughty boy! Peggotty, you savage creature!" I felt the touch of a hand that I knew was neither hers nor Peggotty's, and slipped to my feet. At the bedside, it was Mr. Murdstone's hand, and he kept it on my arm as he said, "What's this, Clara, my love? Have you forgotten? Firmness, my dear." "I am very sorry, Edward," said my mother. "I meant to be very good, but I am so uncomfortable." "Indeed," he answered. "That's a bad hearing so soon, Clara." "I say it's very hard. I should be made so now," returned my mother, pouting. "And it is very hard, isn't it?" He drew her to him, whispered in her ear, and kissed her. I knew as well, when I saw my mother's head lean down upon his shoulder, and her arm touch his neck, I knew as well that he could mold her pliant nature into any form he chose, as I know now that he did it. "Go you below, my love," said Mr. Murdstone. "David and I will come down together, my friend," turning a darkening face on Peggotty when he had watched my mother out and dismissed her with a nod and a smile. "Do you know your mistress's name?" She has been my mistress for a long time, sir," answered Peggotty. "I ought to." "That's true," he answered, "but I thought I heard you, as I came upstairs, address her by a name that is not hers. She has taken mine, you know. Will you remember that?" Peggotty, with some uneasy glances at me, curtsied herself out of the room without replying, seeing, I suppose, that she was expected to go and had no excuse for remaining. When we two were left alone, he shut the door, and sitting on a chair, and holding me standing before him, smiled steadily into my eyes. I felt my own attracted no less steadily to his. My heart beat fast and high. "David," he said, making his lips thin by pressing them together, "if I have an obstinate horse or a dog to deal with, what do you think I do?" "I don't know." "I beat him." I had answered in a kind of breathless whisper, for I felt in my silence that my breath was shorter now. "I make him wince and smart. I say to myself, I'll conquer that fellow, and if it were to cost him all the blood he had, I should do it. What is that upon your face?" "Dirt," I said. He knew it was the mark of tears as well, but if he had asked the question 20 times, each time with 20 blows, I believe my baby heart would have burst before I would have told him so. "You have a good deal of intelligence for a little fellow," he said, with a grave smile that belonged to him. "And you understand me very well, I see. Wash your face, sir, and come down with me." He pointed at the washing stand and motioned me with his head to obey him directly. I had little doubt then, and I have less doubt now, that he would have knocked me down without the least compunction if I had hesitated. "Clara, my dear," he said when I had done his bidding, and he walked me into the parlour with his hand still upon my arm. "Will you not be made uncomfortable any more, I hope?" "You will not be made uncomfortable any more, I hope. We shall soon improve your youthful humours." God help me, I might have improved for my whole life. I might have made another creature, perhaps, for life by a kind word at that season. I thought my mother was sorry to see me standing in the room, so scared and strange. But the word was not spoken, and the time before it was gone. After dinner, when we were sitting by the fire, and I was meditating an escape to Peggotty without having the hardihood to slip away, lest it should offend the master of the house, a coach drove up to the garden gate, and he went out to receive the visitor. My mother followed him. I was timidly following her when she turned round at the parlor door in the dusk, and, taking me in her embrace, as she had been used to do, whispered to me to love my new father and be obedient to him. She did this hurriedly and secretly, as if it were wrong, but tenderly, and putting out her hand behind her, held mine in it, until we came near to where he was standing in the garden, where she let mine go and drew hers through his arm. It was Miss Murdstone who had arrived, and a gloomy-looking lady she was, dark like her brother, whom she greatly resembled in face and voice, and with very heavy eyebrows, nearly meeting over her large nose, as if being disabled by the wrongs of her sex from wearing whiskers. She had carried them to that account. She brought with her 2 uncompromising hard black boxes, with her initials on the lids, in hard brass nails. When she paid the coachman, she took her money out of a hard steel purse, and she kept the purse in a very jail of a bag, which hung upon her arm by a heavy chain, and shut up like a bite. I had never, at that time, seen such a metallic lady altogether as Miss Murdstone was. She was brought into the parlor with many tokens of welcome, and there formally recognized my mother as a new and near relation, and then she looked at me and said, "Is that your boy, sister-in-law?" My mother acknowledged me. "Generally speaking," said Miss Murdstone, "I don't like boys. How do you do, boy?" Under the encouraging circumstances, I replied that I was very well, and I hoped she was the same, with such an indifferent grace that Miss Murdstone disposed of me with 2 words, "Wants manna." Having uttered with great distractedness, she begged the favor of being shown to her room, which became to me from that time forth a place of awe and dread. As well as I could make out, she had come for good, and had no intention of ever going again. On the very first morning after her arrival, she was up and ringing her bell at cock-crow. When my mother came down to breakfast and was going to make tea, Miss Murdstone gave her a kind of peck on the cheek, which was her nearest approach to a kiss, and said, "Now, Clara, my dear, I am come here, you know, to relieve you of all the troubles I can. You're much too pretty and thoughtless." My mother blushed and laughed, and seemed not to dislike this character, "to have any duties imposed upon you that could be undertaken by me. If you'll be so good as to give me your keys, my dear, I'll attend to all this sort of thing in the future." From that time, Miss Murdstone kept her keys in her little pail all day, and under her pillow all night, and my mother had no more to do with them than I had. My mother did not suffer her authority to pass from her without a shadow of protest. One night, when Miss Murdstone had been developing certain household plans to her brother, of which he signified his approbation, my mother suddenly began to cry, and then she thought she might have been consoled. "Clara!" said Mr. Murdstone sternly. "Clara, I wonder at you." "It's very hard," said my mother, "that in my own house—" "My own house," repeated Mr. Murdstone. "Clara!" "Our own house, you mean?" faltered my mother, evidently frightened. "I hope you know what I mean, Edward. It's very hard that in your house I may not have a word to say about domestic matters. I am sure I managed very well before we were married. There's evidence," said my mother, sobbing. "Ask Peggotty if I didn't do very well when I wasn't interfered with." "Edward," said Miss Murdstone, "let there be an end of this. I go tomorrow." "Jane Murdstone," said her brother, "be silent. How dare you to insinuate that you don't know my character better than your words imply? I am sure, my poor mother went on, at a grievous disadvantage and with many tears, I don't want anybody to go. I should be very miserable and unhappy if anybody was to go. I don't ask much. I am not unreasonable. I only want to be consulted sometimes. I am very much obliged to anybody who assists me, and I only want to be consulted as a mere form. Sometimes I thought you were pleased once with my being a little inexperienced and girlish, Edward, but you seem to hate me for it now. You are so severe. Edward, said Miss Murdstone again, let there be an end of this. I go tomorrow. Jane Murdstone, thundered Mr. Murdstone, will you be silent? How dare you? Miss Murdstone made a jail delivery of her pocket handkerchief and held it before her eyes. Clara, he continued, looking at my mother, you surprise me. You astound me. Yes, I had satisfaction in the thought of marrying an inexperienced and artless person, and forming her character, and infusing into it some amount of that firmness and decision of which it stood in need. But when Jane Murdstone is kind enough to come to my assistance in this endeavour, and to assume, for my sake, a condition something like a housekeeper's, and when she meets with a base return— Oh, pray, Edward, cried my mother, don't accuse me of being ungrateful. I am sure I am not ungrateful. No one ever said I was before. I have many faults, but not that. Oh, don't, my dear. When Jane Murdstone meets, I say, he went on after waiting until my mother was silent, with a base return, that feeling of mine is chilled and altered. Don't, my love, say that, implored my mother piteously. Oh, don't, Edward. I can't bear to hear it. Whatever I am affectionate. I know I am affectionate. Ask Peggotty. I am sure she'll tell you I'm affectionate. There is no extent of mere weakness, Clara, said Mr. Murdstone in reply, that can have the least weight with me. You lose breath. Pray let us be friends, said my mother. I couldn't live under coldness or unkindness. I am so sorry. I have a great many defects, I know, and it's very good of you, Edward, with your strength of mind, to endeavour to correct them for me. Jane, I don't object to anything. I should be quite broken-hearted if you thought of leaving. My mother was too much overcome to go on. Jane Murdstone, said Mr. Murdstone to his sister, any harsh words between us are, I hope, uncommon. It is not my fault that so unusual an occurrence has taken place tonight. I was betrayed into it by another. Nor is it your fault. You were betrayed into it by another. Let us both try to forget it. And as this, he added after these magnanimous words, is not a fit scene for the boy, David, go to bed. I could hardly find the door through the tears that stood in my eyes. Going down next morning rather earlier than usual, I paused outside the parlour door. On hearing my mother's voice, she was very earnestly and humbly entreating Miss Murdstone's pardon, which that lady granted, and a perfect reconciliation took place. I never knew my mother afterwards to give an opinion on any matter without first appealing to Miss Murdstone. There had been some talk on occasions of my going to boarding school. Mr. and Miss Murdstone had originated it, and my mother had of course agreed with them. Nothing, however, was concluded on the subject yet. In the meantime, I learnt lessons at home, and there we will pause.